Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I am Esther Mokwariola. From the struggle that preceded independence to the victory that brought about freedom, Africa is often regarded as an unfolding story of hope written in the colors of sorrow, tears, and blood. More than 20 years after the struggle that ended apartheid, South Africa finds itself caught up in a sensitive, complex land reform debate, with the Rainbow Nation torn between white ownership and black history. And so we ask, what are your thoughts on the growing concerns with land redistribution and reform in South Africa? You can join the conversation and share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TVC News NG. We take a report, and Africa Today will continue. Welcome on board.
AfriForum is an interest group representing Afrikaners, the 5% of the population descended mainly from Dutch, German and French settlers. The group has stepped up street protests this year against land distribution plans and what it calls the targeted killing of white farmers.
Mr. Donald Trump, there is indeed an ongoing slaughtering of the white minority people, the Boer people of South Africa.
The best possible outcome that we hoped for was for a statement by the President of the USA, which we got.
AfriForum belongs to a wider movement called Solidarity, which has grown from a 100-year-old trade union into a sprawling and well-resourced organization offering education and training and a range of other services in Afrikaans.
AfriForum has understood this emergence of white chauvinist identities around the world and is manipulating it for its own ends. The problem with that is that it will fracture our communities.
We will resolve this problem in an inclusive basis.
Ramaphosa's vague pledge this year to pursue land expropriation without compensation to right the wrongs of apartheid has given new impetus to both groups who have brushed aside his insistence it will protect property rights. Solidarity says it's reflecting fears rather than stirring them.
There's a culture of fear, but more estrangement, alienation. They feel alienated from South Africa more than only fear.
More fringe white groups, including the survivalist Suidlanders, have been warning for decades that Afrikaners are under threat.
There are racists in Europe and in the USA who are very alarmed about farm murders in South Africa. And we are grateful for the fact that they are alarmed about this, but we don't want them to be associated with us.
Every president since Nelson Mandela led South Africa out of white minority rule in 1994 has tried, and largely failed, to redress an imbalance whereby whites, 9% of 56 million South Africans, own more than 70% of agricultural land. No land has been seized, and while violent crimes is a huge problem, the vast majority of victims are poor and black. Of 20,000 murders in the last recorded year, according to police data, 46 were white people killed on farms. John Skippers and his wife Susie were assaulted on the farm in early November.
They tied her up, they knocked her on the head with a gun, and the one was standing with scissors next to her and told her that if she doesn't give them the keys, they're going to cut her ears off.
Meanwhile, the Suidlanders are preparing for battle, holding guns, clothes and food in bunkers hidden in the dry barren landscape. Its growing membership has drawn up a detailed plan to carve off a section of the country.
This is just one example of our members' preparations. All over South Africa at present, people are preparing for a crisis, and in many cases, they are storing those preparations away from their homes so that they don't have to travel with those preparations in case of urgent flight.
Suidlanders and AfriForum members share a belief that the Afrikaner community is under threat.
Welcome back. Well, before we get into the discussion of the day, let's update you on some top stories around Africa. Britain's Prince Harry is in Zambia for a two-day visit to attend a commemoration of military veterans and meet with social young entrepreneurs and workers. Somalian police say 7 civilians were killed and 5 were wounded when a car bomb detonated at a busy market in the capital, Mogadishu. The World Health Organization says DR Congo has begun the first ever trial to test the effectiveness and safety of 4 experimental Ebola drugs, the first time scientists have directly compared such treatments. And now joining me to look at the growing concerns with land redistribution and reform in South Africa is Okenna Nnebedum, lawyer and a political analyst. And on Skype, I'll be speaking with Ongama Mkimka, lecturer, Department of Political and Conflict Studies, Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University, and he joins me from South Africa. Good to have you gentlemen on the program tonight.
Good evening.
Thank you.
So yes, let me begin with you now, Okenna. So what are your thoughts on this land reform in South Africa, and why has it taken the ANC this long to implement its decade-long promise to the people since 1994 after the apartheid?
Okay, land is a very sensitive matter. Land is an investment. Land is a means of storage of assets, wealth, legacy. And as complex as the issue of land is, it's also even as historically complex the country South Africa is. It's so complex. If I may make an allusion to even the national anthem of South Africa ended with 2 words, just our land. So land in that their national anthem ending that way is not just a rhythmic line. It could be a spiritual connection. Like land is connected spiritually to the aboriginals anywhere in the whole world. It is nothing strange that they are getting emotive about it. But what could be strange is, like your question said, why did they wait this long? But you remember, even when they were negotiating themselves out of apartheid, South Africans were mentioning it, even though those voices were being, they were not magnified. They were saying that prisoners can't negotiate our freedom. They were actually pointing to Nelson Mandela. Okay. They were actually pointing to the fact that the white minorities are using him to negotiate their freedom, which they never supported. But there's something better than where they used to be before. And they had to accept that freedom charter. The negotiation lasted from 1994, and then by the time they got to 1990s, and by the time they got to 1994, the regime of Nelson Mandela was sworn in. You couldn't have expected him with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee or Commission trying to re-establish, reorientate the people, reintegrate the people, make peace. You couldn't have expected him to begin to raise that sensitive matter at that point in time. He did a tenure and handed over to his deputy. And when Thabo Mbeki came on board, there is still need to enculturize the people about the new set of living, the new dynamic, the new milieu, the social milieu that they have got to, face the realities. And right now, about 2 decades, the voice of minorities, the voice of people like Malema is getting louder. And the coming into power of Ramaphosa, who even the American president, sitting President Donald Trump, has a divergent view as against the former president Barack Obama's, some decision and some colorful words he used about the president Ramaphosa. Now, America, are they caught in between a sanction or a condemnation of what is happening there? You may not follow it from the point of view of politics, because there is a law regulating America's relationship economic-wise with Africa, and in particular now South Africa. It has to do with land and property rights. And that is where the problem lies at the moment. But locally, for them, there is an election by the corner in 2019. ANC has, kind of hijacked even the process they themselves initiated in the parliament. So it is something so complex now that certain concessions are being made to the local chiefs. The Zulus are raising stiff opposition to the lands in the local areas. And it could lead into something very slippery. Once you raise political issues, it gets so slimy. There are no guarantees as to how dangerous it could be when it slides into someone's other interests.
Right, let's get more perspective on this issue. We have Ongama Mkimka on Skype. Ongama, so far, the ANC has only transferred 10% of land as against 30% it said it will do in its first 5 years of being in office. What do you think could have been responsible for this lackluster distribution?
So I think South Africa, the land issue is multifaceted. Black people were barred from owning houses in urban areas up until the 1980s. Agricultural land could not be owned except in areas that were designated for black people called the homelands. Now, since 1994, there has been a private sector-led process in terms of which black people can now buy properties in the open market. There's been a process where government is building houses, and government has built over 3 million houses since 1994. And those have been upgrading informal settlements where people previously did not have access to proper housing, now have. But also on top of that, you have had black people used to rent houses in urban areas. But government everywhere in the country started a process of issuing title deeds to people that had occupied these houses, renting them to the state for a long time. So to create the story of land reform, which is an official program of government to take away land, to redistribute land wherein there was claims that's the land restitution aspect, where families have been allowed to claim land that was from which they were forcefully removed. And then reform talks about creating access for people to land ownership and then redistribution. So what has been slow is the process of reallocating land for agricultural purposes. Not necessarily transforming patterns of property ownership in South Africa, because the story there has been quite dramatic. But what you find in the international community are the highly sensationalized stories of what you heard earlier from AfriForum, who are lying and creating the impression that there's about to be a civil war in South Africa, and also the extreme position of Julius Malema and company, who are creating the impression that there hasn't been anything done since 1994. But the middle ground is that government has delivered a huge amount of property ownership to South Africans free. And South Africa's housing program, for example, is one of the most comprehensive in the world, where you find that, similar to the projects in the US or some programs for military veterans in places like Tanzania, where you find that private citizens benefit from government delivery of housing. But land reform has been slow because of the willing buyer, willing seller principle, where the prices of land are determined by markets. Because remember, South Africa opted to become a constitutional democracy, in terms of which rights had to be respected, including the right to property ownership, and that those from whom land gets taken for land reform purposes needed to be compensated. That's the crux of the debate. The idea where the EFF are saying we must have, among the instruments that are existing, expropriation without compensation. But what the people like AfriForum are doing are exploiting that phrasing to suggest that what this process means is that land is going to be snatched from white people and be given to black people. Both politicians and AfriForum are actually creating a false impression, as if that South Africa is going to depart from its constitutional values. And this country has been shown that it has got an independent judiciary and it's got entrenched democratic and constitutional values, which mean there is no government that can pass a law that can result in a section of society being disadvantaged in the manner that Julius Malema are desirous of, or the sensational views that AfriForum are punting in the international community.
Right, that's a fine place to hold your thought now. We need to go on a very quick break. We'll have more discussions on this matter after this. Stay with us. With events of the past often seen as guidelines for the future, many continue to point at experiences of neighboring Zimbabwe whenever the question of land reform is debated in South Africa. Now, former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe embarked on a series of land grabs in early 2000s when about 4,500 farms owned mostly by whites were redistributed among more than 200,000 black Zimbabwean families, a move that led to the collapse of the country's economy. So, Nnebedum, with this, bearing this in mind now, what is a guarantee that South Africa will be better off after the land grabs, as in the case of Zimbabwe in the early 2000s? Do you have any fears with regards to that?
Oh, yes. The fears are political. Political in the sense that statutory, parliamentary process has been triggered by the president himself in parliament.
Right.
But no sooner than he made that announcement inside the parliament in March 2018, and the Vincent committee was about commencing their public sittings and public hearings. They were to engage the public. They were receiving close to 700,000 written memoranda. And before they could, get into the mainstream of the activities, the same president made an announcement that the ANC was going to vote for the policy in the parliament. And by that time, 139 lands has already been earmarked. By that, some people could be reading a truncation. The extremists. What I try to understand from the president's view is that he's trying to pander to the extremists and then pander to the left, to the right, to see if he can reach out to either extremes and then strike a balance. But how he will be able to do that without extricating himself into a political miry clay is what I want to advocate, that he takes the lead from what the managing director of the South African Land Bank said, that it could trigger defaults if it is not redistributed in a way that has a transparent process. Land titles has been given like in a tenure system where you have your deed either leasehold or freehold, but there's no freehold lands in South Africa in their own system. They are leasehold per term. And once those terms and conditions are fulfilled according to the person who is licensee on behalf of the government, those terms has to be respected. And that is what we know as constitutional democracy.
Right.
Because you cannot extricate constitutional rights to property with economic rights. And you want growth in economy, you want food sustainability, you want food security, you want some of the materials you get out from farming are used for pharmaceuticals, and they are intertwined in the economy. It will affect the GDP. Right. Just like you can't go too far in Zimbabwe to see how they couldn't manage it very well and their economy plummeted.
So that means, from your perspective, you see a plus and a negative in this case.
They have a lesson to learn, and then they should learn that lesson very well so that they don't go the way of Zimbabwe.
Now, Ongama, in pushing for an amendment of the Constitution to include expropriation without compensation, the President, Ramaphosa, believes this reform will promote redress, advance economic development and food security. Now, do you think the ANC under Ramaphosa can successfully achieve this?
So the ANC is engaged in this process because it is wanting to close a gap in terms of electoral messaging that has been occupied by the economic freedom fighters. The ANC has never been a part of the BFF has been, and the SACP, the Communist Party. Now, the challenge here is that politicians are playing political gambits which are geared towards securing their position come 2019. I kid you not, it can never happen in South Africa with the kind of judiciary that we have, with the kind of human rights and the trail of cases that government has lost, and the trail of cases where Parliament has actually been found by the Constitutional Court and instructed to make right on or when it has flouted the Constitution. It can never be that South Africa, as a result of this process that's now underway, can have a policy, an amended constitution that violates the principles of a right to own property as well as compensation for property. What I think is going to happen, and I support the move to have expropriation as one of the instruments that are available to government in order to say in specific circumstances. So for example, you have instances where property owners run down buildings as a speculation mechanism to try and speculate on land values and escape from, for example.
OJ seems to be having some challenge with our online resource person. I'm thinking as soon as I have him back online. Okay, I'm thinking Kerry, you go ahead. Okay, since we're having some challenge.
So the point I was making.
Are you there, I'm thinking?
I am. I don't know if you can still hear me.
All right, yeah, I can. Go ahead.
So the point I was making is that there's a case to be made for expropriation without compensation as one of the instruments that Section 25 of the South African Constitution provides for. I don't believe that what we are going to have after this process are land grabs. The tradition of constitutionalism in South Africa just will not allow it. We have a system here that is strongly proven over time, that our judiciary has been able to find against the executive and find against Parliament. Right. And because of those, it's impossible to imagine that we can have land grabs in South Africa.
And let's hope that it doesn't get to that. Thank you very much, Thinker, for your thoughts. But finally, before we wrap up the show, there have been concerns now that South Africans could just have their hopes raised by the objectives of the present government, and the objectives might just be unattainable. Do you share these sentiments?
There's always that objective and that expectation that the land belongs to their ancestors, and they lay claims to the ancestry of the land in South Africa. And there's no taking it away from them. But at the same time, too, there are assertions that they are saying that everybody is an immigrant in South Africa. It doesn't hold water too, but because international rights of aboriginals are restored, and at the same time, the migration law gives you rights to own property anyway in the whole world. And I strongly believe that the multicultural and the multi-tribal, in fact, the multiracial conglomerate on the convergence of tribes and races in South Africa should give them the concern that they should handle this matter in such a way that we will not be seeing a repetition of colonialism in another way in the 21st century.
Right, and we hope it doesn't get to that point. I'd like to thank you again, my guest, Okenna Nnebedum, for your analysis, and Ongama Mkimka via Skype. Thank you very much for your time on Africa Today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Now, the legacies of apartheid continue to persist in South Africa, with social inequality preserved and perpetrated by the lack of economic transformation in the last 2 decades. Elections are due next year, and while the politics of survival looks to gain momentum, all it would take to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor is beyond land reform, where effective resourcefulness complements abundant resources. And that is our package for tonight. But don't forget to join the conversation as usual on Twitter at TVC News NG, and also follow me for updates around Africa at Esther TVC News. Until the next one again, I am Esther Mokwariola, and always remember, Africa can only get better.